In 2008, he shut down more than 7,100 Starbucks stores at the same time, within hours. Not because the company was failing. Not because it was out of money. Starbucks had already grown to over 16,000 stores worldwide, generating billions of dollars in annual revenue. Yet Schultz said something that shook the empire. "We are losing the soul of our company." And in that moment, the world realized, this was never just a business story. What made the decision even more shocking was this: Howard Schultz wasn't destroying Starbucks. He was trying to save it from success itself. At its peak, Starbucks was opening an average of 6 new stores every single day. Revenue was soaring. The brand was everywhere. On paper, it was a perfect success story. But behind the numbers, something was breaking. Coffee machines replaced the sound of hand-ground beans. Speed replaced ritual. Efficiency replaced connection. Customers were still buying coffee, but they were no longer feeling anything. Schultz walked into a Starbucks one morning and didn't recognize it. Not the smell. Not the energy. Not the people behind the counter. He later admitted something few CEOs ever do. "The very growth I fought for was destroying the experience I believed in." So he did the unthinkable. He chose to pause a billion-dollar machine, risk investor trust, and sacrifice short-term profit, to retrain baristas, rebuild culture, and reclaim a soul most corporations never admit they have. Wall Street called it reckless. Analysts called it emotional. But for Schultz, it was personal. Because this wasn't just about coffee. It was about a promise he made decades earlier, as a poor kid watching his father lose everything after one workplace injury. And now, he was facing the same question again. What is success worth, if it turns you into the very thing you once feared? Long before boardrooms, headlines, and global influence, Howard Schultz was a child growing up in the housing projects of Brooklyn, New York, a place defined not by opportunity, but by limitation. This was not the romanticized version of struggle often told in success stories. It was cramped apartments, constant noise, broken infrastructure, and an unspoken understanding that life could turn against you at any moment. People didn't talk about dreams there. They talked about getting through the week. Schultz's family lived paycheck to paycheck, and his father worked a series of physically demanding jobs: delivery driver, factory worker, anything that paid. There was no career path, no benefits, no security. Just labor and hope that nothing went wrong. One winter, something did. His father slipped on an icy loading dock and shattered his ankle. There was no health insurance. No workers' compensation. No protection of any kind. Overnight, the family lost its income. Schultz watched his father, once strong and proud, become trapped at home, angry, humiliated, and powerless. Bills piled up. The mood in the house darkened. What struck young Howard most was not just the financial loss, but the way the system discarded his father the moment he could no longer produce. That image carved itself into his memory. It wasn't just poverty he witnessed, it was disposability. The realization that hard work meant nothing without protection. That loyalty went unrewarded. That dignity could vanish with a single accident. That moment became the emotional foundation of Schultz's entire life. From then on, success stopped being about wealth and became about safety. About control. About never being powerless again. School became his escape, not because he loved it, but because it offered structure. Sports taught him discipline and endurance. But fear was the real engine driving him forward, the fear of ending up like his father, dependent on forces he couldn't influence. He learned early that no one was coming to save him. If he wanted a different life, he would have to build it himself. Through relentless effort, Schultz earned a scholarship to college, becoming the first person in his family to ever do so. Leaving Brooklyn felt like escape, but it also came with a new kind of pressure. On campus, surrounded by students from stable, middle-class backgrounds, Schultz felt exposed. They moved through the world with an ease he didn't recognize. They assumed things would work out. He never did. Poverty leaves behind a psychological residue, and Schultz carried it with him. He worked harder than everyone else, not out of ambition, but out of vigilance. He listened more than he spoke. He observed. He learned how systems functioned, and more importantly, who they failed. After graduation, Schultz entered the workforce with no safety net and no illusions. He gravitated toward sales, a field that mirrored the world he came from, competitive, unforgiving, and indifferent to excuses. Rejection was constant, but familiar. Each no strengthened him. He learned how to read people, how to earn trust, how to sell belief before product. But even as his skills grew, something felt incomplete. He wasn't chasing money for its own sake. He was chasing a sense of purpose he couldn't yet articulate. What lingered beneath everything was the memory of his father sitting helpless at home, and the promise Schultz made silently as a child, that if he ever had power, he would use it differently. He didn't yet know how that promise would take shape. He only knew it would matter. His childhood had given him something most business leaders never acquire, an intimate understanding of what happens when systems forget the human beings inside them. That understanding would later become his compass. But at this stage, it was simply a wound, unhealed, unresolved, and quietly shaping every decision he made. And it was that wound, more than any strategy or ambition, that would eventually lead him toward a path no one around him could yet see. After college, Howard Schultz did not step into a world of opportunity, he stepped into survival with better clothes. He chose sales, not out of passion, but necessity. Sales was brutal, repetitive, humiliating, and deeply educational. Every day meant rejection. Doors closed. Phones hung up. People dismissed him before he finished a sentence. But rejection didn't scare him. It trained him. He learned quickly that people rarely reject ideas, they reject uncertainty. If he could remove doubt, he could move people. He learned how to listen before speaking, how to read hesitation, how to tell a story that made others feel something before asking them to buy. Yet despite becoming good at it, something felt wrong. He was helping companies grow, but he didn't feel connected to what he was building. He wasn't chasing money or status. He was chasing a sense of purpose he couldn't yet define. That restlessness followed him until one odd detail changed everything. While working for a Swedish housewares company, Schultz noticed a small coffee roaster in Seattle ordering an unusually high number of espresso machines. The volume made no sense. Curious, he decided to visit. What he found wasn't impressive by conventional standards, just a few stores, no seating, no grand vision. But something about the place felt different. The employees spoke about coffee with care, almost reverence. Customers listened. There was pride in the work. That company was Starbucks, and Schultz felt an immediate pull, as if he had stumbled onto something honest. He joined the company believing he'd found meaning, but soon realized the experience stopped short. The coffee was excellent, but it ended at the counter. There was no space to stay, no invitation to connect. He sensed untapped potential, but couldn't articulate it, until a trip to Italy rewired his thinking completely. In Milan, Schultz walked into neighborhood coffee bars and felt something he had never felt in American retail. These places were alive. Baristas knew customers by name. Conversations overlapped. People stood shoulder to shoulder, not rushed, not isolated. Coffee wasn't a product being consumed, it was a ritual being shared. The cafe was not home, not work, but something in between. A third place. And in that moment, Schultz understood that what Starbucks lacked was not better beans or faster service, it lacked soul. He returned to Seattle electrified, pitching the idea relentlessly. He talked about community, connection, and experience. He talked about slowing people down in a world obsessed with speed. And he was rejected. Rejected by the founders who feared losing focus. Rejected by investors who didn't believe Americans would pay premium prices to sit and talk. Rejected by banks that saw no scalable logic. Over 200 times, he heard the same answer, no. Advisors warned him not to confuse emotion with strategy. Critics called it naive. But for Schultz, this wasn't an abstract idea. It was personal. He had grown up without a safety net, without dignity, watching his father discarded by a system that valued output over humanity. The Italian cafe wasn't a luxury to him, it was proof that commerce could feel human. And the people who dismissed the idea had never lived without what it provided. Eventually, Schultz made the most frightening decision of his life. He went all in. He raised money piece by piece, borrowed when he shouldn't have, and bought Starbucks outright. There was no backup plan. Failure meant returning to the fear that had followed him since childhood. But success meant proving something radical, that a company could grow without treating people as expendable. From the very beginning, he defied business norms. He called employees partners, not workers. He offered healthcare to part-time staff, not because it was profitable, but because it was right. He believed loyalty was built through respect, not pressure. Growth came fast, almost too fast. Stores multiplied. The brand spread. Starbucks became a symbol of modern urban life. To the outside world, Schultz looked like another entrepreneur chasing scale. But internally, he was chasing something else entirely, a promise. A promise that no one working under his roof would feel disposable. That no child would watch a parent lose everything because a company refused to care. Yet even as Starbucks expanded, a quiet tension formed beneath the success. Schultz could feel it, though he couldn't yet name it. The faster they grew, the harder it became to protect the culture. Efficiency began to compete with experience. Speed challenged ritual. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a question waited patiently. What happens when the very growth that validates your vision begins to erode it? He didn't know the answer yet. He only knew that this path, lonelier, riskier, and harder, was the only one he could live with. And that one day, he would be forced to choose between becoming just another powerful company, or honoring the promise that started it all. Success did not arrive quietly for Howard Schultz. It came fast, visible, and undeniable. What began as a fragile idea rooted in emotion and memory quickly transformed into a cultural phenomenon. Store by store, city by city, Starbucks expanded beyond Seattle and into the American consciousness. This wasn't just growth, it was momentum. Coffee cups became symbols. Green logos appeared on corners that once housed nothing remarkable. And suddenly, Schultz wasn't just building a company. He was shaping a lifestyle. By the mid-1990s, Starbucks was opening stores at a pace few companies had ever attempted. Expansion became aggressive. New locations appeared daily. Urban centers embraced it first, then suburbs, then airports, highways, and campuses. The numbers told a story Wall Street loved. Revenue climbed year after year. Investors praised the brand's consistency. Analysts called it a masterclass in scaling. Starbucks wasn't just selling coffee anymore, it was selling familiarity in an increasingly fragmented world. Wherever people traveled, the same cup waited for them. Predictable. Comfortable. Reliable. But what truly separated Starbucks from other fast-growing chains was its internal culture. Schultz refused to call employees workers. They were partners. That word wasn't symbolic, it carried weight. Starbucks offered health insurance to part-time employees, something almost unheard of in retail at the time. Stock options followed. For many baristas, it was the first time a job treated them as long-term contributors rather than disposable labor. Loyalty surged. Turnover dropped. The media took notice. Schultz was celebrated not only as a visionary entrepreneur, but as a rare moral voice in corporate America. The narrative was irresistible. A boy from the Brooklyn projects builds a billion-dollar company without abandoning his values. A CEO who spoke openly about dignity, responsibility, and shared success. Schultz appeared on magazine covers. Business schools taught Starbucks as a case study. Politicians cited him as proof that capitalism could be compassionate. To the public, he represented a modern American dream, one updated for a world hungry for meaning, not just money. Inside the company, the energy was electric. Employees believed in what they were building. Customers felt part of something bigger than a transaction. Starbucks stores became meeting points, safe spaces, and daily rituals. The third place idea worked. People lingered. Conversations happened. Coffee became a reason to pause in an otherwise accelerating world. Schultz watched his vision come to life on a scale he had never imagined. For a man who grew up powerless, this was vindication. But beneath the applause, a subtle shift was taking place. Growth demanded speed. Speed demanded systems. Systems demanded efficiency. And efficiency, slowly, began to challenge intimacy. New espresso machines replaced manual processes. Store layouts standardized. Training compressed. What once felt handcrafted began to feel optimized. Customers didn't complain. Sales didn't drop. In fact, profits rose faster than ever. From the outside, Starbucks looked unstoppable. Schultz felt the tension but pushed forward. He told himself this was the cost of impact. That to reach more people, something had to be simplified. He believed the culture was strong enough to survive expansion. After all, the numbers proved him right. Starbucks was no longer a risky idea, it was a global force. The brand expanded internationally. Europe, Asia, the Middle East. Each new market reinforced the belief that Starbucks had cracked a universal code. At its height, the company was opening an average of several stores every single day. Internal meetings focused on logistics, supply chains, and operational metrics. Investors demanded more growth. Analysts expected continuous upward curves. The market rewarded speed, not reflection. And Schultz, the man who once fought for soul over scale, now found himself managing a machine that never slept. The irony wasn't lost on him, but it was easy to ignore while everything seemed to be working. Public praise became constant. Awards piled up. Schultz was invited to speak not just about business, but about leadership, ethics, and the future of work. His story inspired millions. Yet with every success came distance. Distance from the store floor. Distance from baristas. Distance from the small details that once mattered deeply to him. Leadership became abstract. Culture became something measured in surveys instead of felt in conversations. This was the golden era, the peak. Starbucks had become a global symbol of modern life. Schultz had become a symbol of enlightened capitalism. From the outside, there was no reason to slow down. No reason to question the formula. But inside, something subtle was eroding. Not profits. Not growth. Something quieter. Something harder to measure. The promise that started it all. Schultz had built exactly what he set out to build, a company that proved business could be different. But success had introduced a new danger, complacency disguised as confidence. The systems that protected the brand now threatened its humanity. The very scale that validated his vision was beginning to stretch it thin. And while the world celebrated the triumph, Schultz felt a growing unease he couldn't silence. Because he knew this truth better than anyone, when a company grows faster than its values, something eventually breaks. He had seen it happen before, to his father, to families, to people crushed by systems that stopped seeing them as human. Now, standing at the top of everything he once dreamed of, Schultz faced a question he had spent his life avoiding. Was he still building the company he promised himself he would build? Or had success quietly turned him into the very thing he feared becoming? The answer wouldn't come immediately. But the fall, when it arrived, would force him to confront it head-on. The collapse did not begin with headlines or financial disaster. It began quietly, invisibly, inside the very system Howard Schultz had built to protect people. Starbucks was still growing, still profitable, still admired. But something fundamental had shifted. Decisions were no longer shaped by belief, but by momentum. Meetings were no longer about experience, but efficiency. The company had become extraordinarily good at expanding, and dangerously indifferent to what expansion was costing. Schultz felt it first as discomfort, then as doubt, and finally as a kind of guilt he couldn't explain. He would walk into stores and sense something missing. The smiles felt trained. The rhythm felt rushed. The ritual he once fought for was being replaced by throughput. Coffee was being optimized, not honored. The machine demanded speed. Investors expected growth curves to remain vertical. Analysts rewarded scale, not restraint. Every quarter became a test of endurance. And slowly, leadership moved away from the floor and into abstraction. Schultz found himself speaking more to spreadsheets than to people. Metrics replaced intuition. Dashboards replaced conversations. He was still the face of the company, still praised for values-driven leadership, but internally he felt a growing distance between who he was and what Starbucks had become. The irony was brutal. He had built Starbucks to humanize work, yet now he was overseeing a system that risked dehumanizing it through sheer scale. Then came the decision that deepened the fracture. Schultz stepped away from the CEO role. On paper, it was a transition, strategic, orderly, necessary. In reality, it was avoidance. He believed the company was strong enough to run without him, that the culture he embedded would sustain itself. But culture doesn't run on memory. It runs on presence. Without him at the center, the forces of efficiency accelerated unchecked. Store counts surged. Automation increased. Training shortened. The soul he once guarded personally was now delegated to systems designed for speed. When Schultz returned to Starbucks stores as a visitor, not a leader, the truth hit him harder than any earnings report ever could. He stood in line and listened. Baristas sounded exhausted. Customers sounded impatient. The smell of coffee no longer carried warmth, it carried familiarity without meaning. The third place felt transactional. No one lingered. No one connected. It worked. And that was the problem. It worked too well. Schultz realized that Starbucks hadn't failed. It had succeeded at the wrong thing. This was not a business crisis. It was a moral one. He began to see himself reflected in the system. A man who once feared becoming invisible now presided over a company that risked making others feel the same way. The memory of his father returned with force. A hardworking man discarded the moment he became inconvenient. Schultz had sworn never to replicate that dynamic. Yet here he was, leading a global empire that rewarded output more than humanity. The realization was devastating. Success hadn't corrupted Starbucks overnight. It had eroded it slowly, disguised as progress. Internally, Schultz unraveled. He questioned every decision that had led them here. Every compromise justified by scale. Every shortcut taken in the name of growth. He wondered if he had mistaken reach for impact, consistency for connection. Worse, he wondered if the very idea he championed, a company with a soul, was naive from the start. Maybe the critics were right. Maybe capitalism always consumes its ideals. Maybe this was inevitable. The pressure mounted. Publicly, Schultz remained composed. Privately, he carried the weight of betrayal, not from others, but from himself. He had promised a different kind of company. And now he was watching it drift away, piece by piece, under his watch. Sleep became difficult. The questions never stopped. Was he still the man who built Starbucks, or just the executive who scaled it beyond recognition? Was stepping aside a mistake, or proof that he no longer had the courage to fight? The darkest thought crept in quietly. Maybe the company no longer needed him because it no longer stood for what he believed in. Maybe the promise was already broken. And if that was true, then everything he had built, every store, every accolade, every dollar, stood on unstable ground. Because when a company loses its soul, it doesn't collapse immediately. It keeps running. Until one day, someone finally dares to stop it. The breaking point didn't come with a crash. It came with clarity. Howard Schultz realized that the most dangerous moment in leadership isn't failure, it's success without reflection. Starbucks was still winning. The numbers still impressed. The brand still dominated. And that was precisely why stopping it felt impossible. No one wanted to hear about soul when growth was still accelerating. No one wanted to slow down a machine that printed billions. But Schultz understood something most executives never confront. If you wait for the numbers to tell you something is wrong, you've already waited too long. He returned to the company with a weight on his chest. This time, not as a visionary chasing expansion, but as a guardian trying to rescue something fragile. He reviewed reports, visited stores, listened to frontline workers. The pattern was unmistakable. Speed had replaced care. Consistency had replaced craft. Starbucks had become a brand optimized for convenience, not connection. And with every operational improvement, something human had been quietly stripped away. Schultz recognized the pattern instantly. He had lived it before. Systems that valued output above dignity always ended the same way. The question was no longer whether Starbucks had drifted. It was whether he had the courage to admit it publicly, and act against every incentive pushing him forward. Because the solution wasn't incremental. It wasn't cosmetic. It required a shock. A pause. A moment so disruptive it would force the entire organization to confront what it had become. In 2008, Schultz made the decision that would redefine his legacy. He ordered the closure of more than 7,100 Starbucks stores across the United States, at the same time. For several hours, the company shut itself down. Not because of a financial emergency. Not because of a supply failure. But to retrain baristas. To refocus on craft. To reset culture. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Wall Street panicked. Media outlets called it reckless. Analysts questioned his sanity. Billions of dollars in market value trembled. No one could understand why a CEO would willingly stop a machine that was still making money. Schultz understood exactly why. Because money had become the distraction. The company was still profitable, but it was hollowing itself out. And hollow companies don't collapse suddenly, they decay until nothing meaningful remains. This shutdown wasn't about coffee. It was about accountability. It was Schultz standing in front of the company and saying, "We lost our way, and that's on me." Internally, the decision shook everyone. Some leaders resisted. Others feared the fallout. But on the store floors, something unexpected happened. Baristas felt seen again. Training slowed down. Conversations returned. The ritual mattered. For the first time in years, the company stopped running long enough to remember why it existed. Schultz didn't present himself as a savior. He presented himself as someone willing to admit failure at the highest level. That honesty cut through the noise more powerfully than any speech ever could. Privately, Schultz faced his own reckoning. He had to accept that values are not self-sustaining. They erode without constant defense. He had to confront the uncomfortable truth that he had allowed growth to outrun culture, believing he could fix it later. This moment proved there is no later. There is only now, or never. Leadership, he realized, isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about recognizing them early enough to stop the damage. The shutdown marked the end of an illusion. Starbucks would never again be allowed to grow without asking hard questions. Schultz recentered the company around training, experience, and human connection. Expansion slowed. Some stores closed permanently. Others were redesigned. Profit dipped before it stabilized. Critics remained. But something essential returned. The company felt intentional again. Not perfect. Not immune to pressure. But awake. For Schultz, this wasn't redemption yet. It was responsibility. He stopped chasing admiration and started embracing discomfort. He no longer measured success by store count or stock price alone, but by whether the company still honored the promise he made decades earlier, as a child watching his father lose dignity because no system cared. This time, he refused to look away. The collapse had been internal long before it was visible. And the recovery required something far rarer than strategy. It required humility. The willingness to admit that success can be as dangerous as failure. That power without reflection corrodes. And that sometimes, the bravest move a leader can make is to stop everything, risking reputation, wealth, and control, to protect what can't be measured. This moment did not make Starbucks invincible. But it made something else possible. A second chance. And with it, the beginning of a different kind of leadership, one no longer driven by fear of falling back into poverty, but by the courage to preserve meaning at the highest cost. When Howard Schultz stepped back into leadership, it wasn't with triumph, it was with restraint. The bravest part of the turnaround wasn't the shutdown itself, it was what came after, when the noise faded and the hard work began. Rebuilding a company's soul doesn't happen with a press release. It happens in repetition, in discipline, in choices that rarely make headlines. Schultz understood this time there would be no shortcuts. If Starbucks was going to recover, it would have to relearn how to move slowly in a world that demanded speed. He began by changing the questions leadership asked. Meetings no longer started with store counts or quarterly projections. They started with experience. How did the coffee taste today? Did customers linger or leave? Did partners feel pride when they put on the apron? Schultz insisted that leaders return to the floor, not for appearances, but for listening. He wanted executives to hear the fatigue in baristas' voices, to feel the friction at peak hours, to notice where efficiency had replaced care. Data still mattered, but it no longer ruled. Intuition was invited back into the room. Training became sacred again. Time was carved out, not optimized, to teach craft and context. Baristas weren't rushed through checklists, they were taught why the work mattered. Schultz believed that meaning scales only when understanding does. Stores were redesigned to restore warmth. Music returned with intention. The smell of coffee was allowed to lead. The third place was no longer a slogan, it was a standard that could fail a store if ignored. Growth slowed, deliberately. Some locations closed. Others paused expansion until culture caught up. Investors questioned the pace. Schultz accepted the criticism. He had learned that alignment costs more than acceleration, but it lasts longer. Internally, the tone changed. Fear loosened its grip. Partners felt permission to speak honestly again. Schultz modeled vulnerability in a way few CEOs dare. He acknowledged missteps without defensiveness. He reminded the company that values aren't proven when things are easy, but when they're expensive. That message landed. Trust rebuilt not because Starbucks promised perfection, but because it practiced accountability. The organization learned a new rhythm, one that allowed reflection alongside performance. Schultz himself changed. The restless urgency that once drove him softened into patience. He stopped trying to outrun his past and began integrating it. The fear of poverty no longer dictated every decision. In its place grew a steadier resolve: protect what matters, even if it costs. He became less enamored with applause and more committed to stewardship. Leadership, he realized, wasn't about being right early, it was about being responsible late, when the consequences finally surface. The recovery wasn't instant. Profits dipped before stabilizing. Critics remained skeptical. But something fundamental shifted. Starbucks felt awake again. Stores regained personality. Partners regained pride. Customers noticed, not because prices dropped or menus changed dramatically, but because the experience felt human again. People lingered. Conversations returned. The pause had worked, not because it was dramatic, but because it was sincere. This rebirth didn't erase the past, it reframed it. Schultz accepted that the earlier version of success was incomplete. Necessary, perhaps, but insufficient. He learned that scale magnifies intent, good or bad, and that leaders must constantly re-anchor their organizations to first principles. The turnaround became less about saving Starbucks and more about redefining how success should feel. Winning without meaning was no longer acceptable. Growth without guardianship was no longer tolerated. As the company steadied, Schultz prepared to step back again, this time with clarity. Not as an escape, but as a transition grounded in systems that could carry values forward. He focused on developing leaders who understood not just how to execute, but why restraint matters. Starbucks would continue to face pressure, competition, and temptation. That would never change. What changed was the internal compass. It pointed back to people. The turning point was not a single decision, it was a posture. A willingness to stop, to listen, to choose long-term integrity over short-term applause. Rebirth, Schultz learned, isn't about returning to what was, it's about becoming more honest about what must be protected. And in that honesty, Starbucks found its footing again. This wasn't the end of struggle. It was the end of denial. And from that place, a different kind of legacy began to take shape, one built not on uninterrupted ascent, but on the courage to correct course when the climb threatens to hollow you out. After the turbulence settled, Howard Schultz began to step back, not to disappear, but to reposition himself where influence mattered more than control. The chapter of constant intervention was over. What followed was quieter, but no less deliberate. Schultz understood that true legacy is tested not by what a founder builds, but by what survives when they loosen their grip. Starbucks no longer needed a rescuer, it needed guardians. His role shifted from operator to steward, from decision-maker to signal setter. Publicly, Schultz became more reflective. He spoke less about domination and more about responsibility. Less about growth curves and more about human cost. He acknowledged openly that success had almost derailed the very values it promised to amplify. This honesty reframed his story. No longer just the entrepreneur who scaled a coffee company into a global brand, he became a case study in restraint, proof that leadership can mature instead of harden. He emphasized that values are not a phase in a company's life cycle, they are a practice that requires constant defense. Within Starbucks, the systems he helped rebuild were designed to outlast personality. Training programs embedded context, not just process. Leadership development prioritized judgment over speed. Cultural metrics were treated with the same seriousness as financial ones. Schultz insisted that future leaders be fluent in the company's origin story, not as mythology, but as responsibility. The past was no longer a marketing asset, it was a warning label. Grow, but don't drift. Win, but don't forget who pays the price when you do. Outside the company, Schultz's influence expanded in a different direction. He engaged in conversations about healthcare, education, and work with the same urgency that once fueled expansion. The boy from Brooklyn who watched his father lose dignity never stopped chasing protection for others. That wound never healed, it evolved into purpose. Schultz spoke about capitalism not as an ideology, but as a tool that must be shaped by conscience. He challenged the assumption that shareholder value is the sole measure of success, arguing instead for stakeholder responsibility grounded in lived experience. Critics remained, and Schultz accepted that too. He didn't seek unanimity anymore. He understood that leadership built on values invites disagreement. The point was not to be liked, it was to be clear. Starbucks would still make mistakes. Markets would still shift. Pressure would never disappear. But the company now had a language to confront those moments without denial. That, to Schultz, was progress. As years passed, the scale of Starbucks became almost secondary to the conversation it sparked. Business schools dissected its evolution not just for strategy, but for ethics under pressure. Leaders from other industries looked to Schultz's decisions during crisis as permission to pause, to correct, to admit fault without surrendering authority. His legacy crystallized around a single idea: that growth without guardianship is not ambition, it is neglect. Schultz never claimed perfection. He spoke candidly about the tension between ideals and reality, about how easily good intentions are diluted by momentum. What distinguished his journey was not that he avoided that trap, but that he recognized it early enough to turn back. Life after the peak taught him that leadership isn't proven in ascent, but in what you refuse to sacrifice once you've arrived. In the end, Schultz didn't leave behind a flawless company. He left behind a framework, a reminder that organizations are human systems before they are economic ones, and that the cost of forgetting this truth is always higher than it appears. His story settled into something deeper than inspiration. It became instruction. And as the noise of daily operations continued without him, one measure mattered more than all others: when pressure returned, would the company remember why it existed? That question, more than store count or valuation, became the quiet inheritance he left behind. In the end, the story of Howard Schultz is not about coffee, stores, or even success. It is about a promise made by a frightened child watching his father lose dignity because no system cared enough to protect him. Everything that followed, every risk, every expansion, every painful correction, grew from that moment. Schultz didn't build Starbucks to prove he was smart. He built it to prove that power doesn't have to be cruel, and that growth doesn't have to erase humanity. His journey reminds us that success is not a straight line upward. It bends. It drifts. And if left unchecked, it can quietly transform us into what we once feared. The true test of leadership is not how fast you rise, but whether you are willing to stop, look inward, and admit when you've lost your way. Schultz did not save Starbucks by chasing more. He saved it by choosing less speed, less ego, less noise, and more meaning. The most dangerous lie in modern ambition is that winning excuses everything. Schultz's life stands as a quiet rebuttal. Winning without conscience is not victory, it is delay. Delay before collapse, before regret, before disconnection. What endures is not scale, but intention defended over time. And perhaps that is the final lesson. You don't build a meaningful legacy by never failing. You build it by refusing to abandon what matters most when failure, or success, tries to pull you away from it. The question Schultz leaves behind is simple and unavoidable. When your moment of power comes, what will you protect?